the war room of the Coalition flagship Eternal. Vigilance hummed with nervous energy as commanders from across the galaxy gathered around the massive holographic display that showed the Sigma Station Sector in painful detail. Commander Velthus stood at the center of the circular chamber, his towering Zentari form casting long shadows across the blue-lit faces of military officers from a dozen different species. The news was bad, and everyone knew it. The Krethian armada had broken through the defensive perimeter at Sigma Station 3 days ago and now threatened 3 colony worlds with a combined population of nearly 2 million souls. Vile has manipulated the holographic controls with his primary manipulator appendages, while his secondary arms gestured emphatically to emphasize key points of the tactical situation. The Krethian fleet consists of 47 capital ships, 112 heavy cruisers, and an estimated 300 support vessels. Velthus announced in his deep, resonant voice that carried the weight of 200 years of military experience. They are advancing in standard Krethian battle formation, which, as we all know, prioritizes honor and direct engagement. Around the circular table, representatives from the Coalition member species began voicing their concerns and suggestions with the practiced efficiency of experienced military professionals. The Orvian tactical officer Yisler raised one of her 4 arms to indicate she wished to speak. Her species was known for methodical thinking and defensive strategies that had protected their homeworld for 3,000 years. Commander, I propose we implement rotating shield formations using the Turxian defense pattern, Shalar said, her translator rendering her clicking speech into standard galactic. This would allow our vessels to maintain defensive coverage while cycling power reserves. The Korthax representative, a massive reptilian warrior named Grax, slammed his clawed fist on the table with enough force to make the holographic display flicker momentarily. Defense is cowardice, Grax growled, his crest flaring with aggressive red and orange patterns. We should meet the Krethian fleet in direct combat as warriors should and crush them with superior firepower. The Sifori observer, a being of crystalline structure whose species processed information through quantum calculations in their molecular lattice, chimed in with probability assessments that painted a complex picture of potential outcomes. The statistical likelihood of successful engagement using current Coalition doctrine is 63.7%, the Seferi stated in a voice that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. However, casualty projections suggest we would lose between 12 and 18% of our fleet strength, with an estimated civilian death toll ranging from 40,000 to 90,000 depending on evacuation efficiency and Krethian targeting priorities. The discussion continued for another 20 minutes with each species bringing their unique perspective to the tactical problem. The Zentari favored bold maneuvers that showcased individual ship commander excellence. The Orvians wanted layered defensive strategies. The Korthax demanded aggressive assault. The Seferi calculated probabilities. Through all of this, one person remained completely silent. Lieutenant Marcus Webb sat at the far end of the table in the designated for junior advisors and specialist consultants. The human was relatively small compared to most of the other beings in the room, his species being newcomers to the Galactic Coalition. With less than 50 years of membership, Webb's hands were steepled in front of his face, his fingers pressed together in a gesture that might have looked like prayer to some species. His eyes, however, were not closed in meditation. They moved constantly, tracking every piece of information on the holographic display, watching every commander who spoke, analyzing every tactical proposal with a nice intensity that seemed almost predatory. Most of the assembled Officers barely noticed the silent human humanity was a recent addition to the coalition, and their military contributions had been modest compared to the ancient warrior races that dominated coalition military, thinking they had a small but respectable fleet and their ground forces were competent enough. But nothing suggested they were exceptional in the grand scheme of galactic warfare. Captain Shalar, however, had noticed the Orvian officer had served on a joint task force with human military personnel 2 years ago during the Fringe piracy suppression campaign. She had learned something during that deployment that now made her secondary hearts beat faster with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Humans stopped talking during tactical discussions. It did not mean they were disengaged. It meant they were working it. Meant they had stopped listening to the current plan because they were already tearing it apart in their minds, finding every flaw, every assumption, every weakness. It meant they were formulating something that would make everyone in the room deeply uncomfortable. Shalar's people had a saying, "Beware the silent predator, for it has already chosen its prey." She had never understood that saying's full implications until she watched human military advisors work. The briefing continued with Velthas outlining the proposed battle plan in greater detail. The coalition fleet would engage the Krethians in 3 waves, using superior numbers and coordination to overcome the Krethian advantage in individual ship combat effectiveness. It was a solid plan, based on centuries of coalition military doctrine. It would probably work. It would also cost thousands of lives and take months to fully execute. Webb remained motionless except for the constant tracking of his eyes and the slight movement of his fingers as they occasionally tapped against each other in what might have been calculations or simply nervous energy. 45 minutes into the briefing, just as Velthas was concluding his presentation and preparing to assign fleet positions, Webb finally moved. He lowered his hands and raised one arm in the gesture that indicated a request to speak. Room fell silent. Velthas turned to look at the human, surprise evident in the way his ceremonial battle crests flared slightly. "Lieutenant Webb," Velthas said with the carefully neutral tone of a superior officer who was not certain whether to be annoyed or curious about the interruption. "Do you have a question about the battle plan?" "No, sir," Webb replied in a quiet voice that somehow carried clearly through the large chamber despite its lack of volume. "I do not have a question." He stood slowly, his movements controlled and precise. "I have a request." "Commander." Webb walked toward the holographic display, his small human form seeming almost fragile compared to the towering Centauri. "Commander, permission to present an alternative strategy." "Sir." The room's atmosphere changed immediately. Several officers exchanged glances. Grax, the Korthax, made a sound that might have been a laugh or a growl. The Scifistories' crystalline structure flickered with colors that indicated heightened interest, but it was Shilar who reacted most noticeably. The Orvian captain closed all 4 of her eyes and lowered her head in a gesture that her species used when preparing for inevitable disaster. She whispered something in her native language that the translators did not pick up, but which roughly translated to, "May the ancestors grant us wisdom to understand what we are about to witness." Velthas studied the human for a long moment, his experienced military mind trying to assess what this young officer from a relatively unknown species could possibly offer that the assembled wisdom of the coalition's greatest military minds had not already considered. "You wish to critique a battle plan developed by Coalition Strategic Command?" Velthas asked, his tone carrying a hint of warning. "No, sir," Webb replied, his expression remaining neutral and respectful. "I wish to propose that we abandon it entirely." The room erupted in shocked exclamations. Velats raised both primary arms to call for silence, his commanding presence quickly restoring order. "That is a bold statement, Lieutenant," Velthas said, his voice carrying both curiosity and warning. Assume you have substantial reasoning to support such a radical proposition. Yes, sir, Webb said simply. May I proceed? Valthas gestured to the holographic controls. Show us what you have in mind. Lieutenant, Webb stepped to the display, and the first thing he did made several officers gasp in disbelief. He minimized the entire coalition fleet deployment, all of it. Every carefully positioned ship, every tactical formation, every strategic element of the plan that had taken Coalition Strategic Command 3 days to develop gone. With a simple gesture, we are not using the fleet, Webb said in that same quiet, matter-of-fact tone. Not in the way you have planned. The outrage was immediate, and vocal cracks roared about cowardice. Other officers shouted questions. Valthas called for order again, his voice taking on a sharp edge. Explain yourself. Lieutenant, Valthas commanded. Now, Webb pulled up different data streams, his fingers moving quickly across the holographic interface, as he overlaid information that seemed completely unrelated to the military situation. Raytheon supply line, data communication relay maintenance schedules, migration patterns of the space-dwelling creatures called Void Ray civilian mining outpost locations, trade route information, weather patterns in stellar nebulae. The Crethians fight with honor, Webb began, his voice taking on a lecturing quality that seemed almost apologetic. They announced their fleet movements according to the ancient codes of warfare. They engage in formal battle formations that date back thousands of years. They respect the traditions of their ancestors, and they expect their enemies to do the same. He turned. Webb manipulated the holographic display with practiced efficiency, bringing up layers of information that painted a picture so different from traditional coalition warfare that several officers leaned forward in confusion, trying to understand what they were seeing. The Crethian Armada operates on a supply chain that depends on 3 primary logistics hubs, Webb explained, highlighting points on the star map that were nowhere near the actual battle zone. They refuel every 48 hours, resupply ammunition every 72 hours, and rotate crew rest periods on a rigid schedule that has not changed in 300 years because it is part of their military tradition. He zoomed in on a communications relay station. This relay handles all encrypted Crethian fleet communications for this sector, and it is scheduled for routine maintenance in 18 hours. Webb continued. During maintenance, they will switch to backup systems which we can access because human intelligence operatives mapped their backup protocols 6 months ago. Captain Shallar's secondary hearts were racing now because she recognized what she was seeing. This was not a battle plan, this was something else entirely. You are proposing espionage, Valthas said, his voice carrying a mixture of shock and something that might have been fascination. Not just espionage, sir, Webb replied. I am proposing that we make the Crethians believe we are abandoning the colonies entirely. The room exploded. In outraged voices again, abandoning colonies was unthinkable. It violated every principle of coalition military doctrine. Valthas raised his voice to restore order, but Webb simply continued talking in that same quiet, relentless tone. We broadcast urgent communications on channels we know the Crethians can intercept, Webb said, pulling up sample message traffic he had already prepared. These messages will be encrypted, but not very well because we want them to break the encryption and believe they have gained valuable intelligence. He displayed the fake communications, which spoke of coalition fleet withdrawals, strategic repositioning to protect core worlds, and the difficult decision to sacrifice the Sigma Station colonies to preserve the greater coalition. The Crethians will interpret this as cowardice, Webb continued. Their honor code demands they punish such cowardice, which means they will press their advantage and advance more aggressively than they otherwise would. The Seferi Observer's crystalline structure was flickering rapidly, with colors indicating intense calculation. This would cause the Krethian fleet to overextend their supply lines. The Scifistories stated, probability of success increases by 17.3% if they accelerate their advance, but this strategy depends on deception, which violates coalition ethical warfare protocols. Yes, Webb agreed simply it does. He pulled up more data, showing human intelligence assets positioned throughout Krethian territory officers, who were not actually officers, but intelligence operatives with false identities merchants, who were actually information gatherers diplomats who spent their time mapping communication networks and identifying security vulnerabilities. Human intelligence services have been operating in Krethian space for 2 years. Webb said, not because we anticipated war, but because gathering information is what human intelligence services do as a matter of standard practice. Grax the Korthax slammed the table again. This is not warfare. The reptilian warrior growled. This is treachery and lies. Yes. Webb agreed again without any apparent shame. It is. He pulled up the next phase of his plan, which involved deploying thousands of disguised proximity mines along the Krethian advance route. These mines will be camouflaged as stellar debris using technology we adapted from asteroid mining operations. Webb explained, they will not be powerful enough to destroy Krethian ships because we do not want to destroy their fleet. Velphas was staring at the human now with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand something disturbing. You want to damage them just enough to create chaos, the Zentari commander said slowly. You want them angry and confused and pushing forward into what they think is an easy victory. Correct, sir. Webb confirmed. He displayed the next phase, which showed the colony worlds themselves. We evacuate all civilians from the 3 threatened colonies. Webb said, we do this quietly over the next 72 hours using civilian transport vessels that are registered as merchant traffic, so the Krethians do not realize we are evacuating. When the Krethian fleet arrives at the colonies, they will find empty cities and infrastructure but no people. They will have expended enormous resources and taken damage from the mines to conquer nothing. The holographic display shifted again, showing coalition fleet positions that were completely different from the original battle plan. The fleet was not positioned to defend the colonies. The fleet was positioned behind the Krethian advance, cutting off their retreat and supply lines. At this point, the Krethian armada will be extended, damaged, low on supplies, and occupying worthless territory, Webb said. That is when we reveal the actual trap. He pulled up data on civilian vessels throughout the sector, merchant ships, mining vessels, transport craft, even passenger liners. Each one was marked with indicators showing recent modifications over the past month. Human engineering teams have been quietly installing military-grade weapons on every civilian vessel in 3 sectors. Webb explained calmly, as if he were discussing routine maintenance schedules. Not enough firepower to match a warship in direct combat, but we are not planning direct combat. The display showed tactical simulations of thousands of small vessels, using hit-and-run tactics against a conventional military fleet strike. From unexpected angles, fire and immediately retreat. Never present a clear target, never engage in honorable single combat predatory behavior shark tactics. Civilian vessels do not follow military protocols. Webb continued. They are unpredictable and the Krethians have no tactical doctrine for dealing with thousands of small, armed civilian craft operating independently with no central command structure. He looked around the room at the shocked faces. Meanwhile, the actual coalition military fleet enters the engagement fresh and at full strength, while the Krethian armada is scattered, damaged, and trying to fight an enemy that refuses to engage them in the honorable warfare they were trained for. Captain Shalar finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You have been planning this for months, she said. All of this infrastructure, the intelligence gathering, the civilian ship modifications, the evacuation logistics. You did not just create this plan in the last. Our web turned to face the Orvian captain. Human military doctrine requires us to develop contingency plans for every potential conflict scenario. He said, when humanity joined the coalition, we analyzed every potential threat and began preparing responses. We have plans like this for every major military power in coalition space. The silence that followed that statement was profound and deeply uncomfortable. Velth stared at the human with an expression that mixed respect, horror, and something that might have been fear. You are saying that humanity has been preparing to fight coalition members since you joined the coalition? Velth said slowly. Yes, sir. Webb confirmed without hesitation. We prepare for every possibility because that is what kept our species alive through 10,000 years of constant warfare on our homeworld. He gestured to the tactical display. But we are not fighting coalition members today, and I am offering this plan to help the coalition because we are allies and because this strategy will save lives. The Sifuri's crystalline form flickered with new colors, calculating revised casualty projections based on proposed human strategy. The Sifuri announced estimated coalition military casualties, less than 1% estimated civilian casualties, 0 if evacuation executes properly estimated time to Krethian surrender, 72 hours probability of success, 89.6%. The numbers were stunning. Grax was no longer shouting about cowardice. The Korthax warrior was staring at the tactical display with the expression of someone who had just realized they were looking at something they had never seen before. This is not how warfare is conducted, Grax said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Webb nodded slowly. This is not how galactic warfare is conducted, he agreed. This is how human warfare is conducted. We do not fight for glory or honor or approve warrior excellence. We fight to survive and to win, and we have spent our entire history developing strategies to do both. Velthes walked to the display and studied Webb's plan in detail for several long minutes. The room remained silent except for the soft humming of the holographic generators. Finally, the Zenray commander turned to face his officers. I need opinions, Velthes said. Captain Shalar, you have worked with human military personnel before, and what is your assessment? Shalar took a moment to compose herself before responding. Commander, I have seen humans execute tactical operations that violated every principle of honorable warfare I was taught, she said carefully. I have also seen those operations succeed with minimal casualties, when conventional approaches would have cost thousands of lives. She looked at Webb. Humans do not fight the way we fight, and that makes them uncomfortable eyes. But they are effective. The Sefri chimed in with its crystalline voice. From a purely mathematical perspective, the human straight. Commander Velthes authorized the human strategy after 3 hours of intense debate and consultation with Coalition Strategic Command. The decision came with explicit documentation that this represented a fundamental shift in coalition military doctrine, and that responsibility for the ethical implications rested with the command staff, not with Lieutenant Webb, who was simply offering his expertise as requested. Webb accepted this without comment and immediately began coordinating the operation with an efficiency that suggested he had been ready to execute this plan at a moment's notice. Phase 1 initiated exactly 18 hours after the briefing, when the Krethian communications relay switched to backup systems for scheduled maintenance. Human intelligence operatives who had infiltrated Krethian information networks years ago activated protocols that allowed coalition signals intelligence to access Krethian command communications. Webb sat in the coalition intelligence center surrounded by officers from species that had never needed dedicated intelligence operations. Because they fought their wars openly, he coordinated with human operatives whose identities were so carefully constructed that they had lived as Krethian citizens for years. Some had families in Krethian space. Some held positions in Krethian civilian government. Some were simply merchants who happened to be in the right places to observe military movements. The Krethians, who valued honor and transparency in warfare, had no defense against people who had spent years pretending to be someone else. Target their pride. Webb instructed his intelligence team via encrypted channels. Make them think we are cowards running from honorable combat, and make them angry enough to push harder than their logistics can support. The false communications began broadcasting. On channels the Coalition knew the Krethians monitored urgent messages between Coalition commanders discussing the difficult decision to abandon the Sigma Station colonies. Heated arguments about protecting core worlds versus defending frontier settlements. Resigned acceptance that the colonies could not be held against the Krethian Armada. The encryption on these messages was deliberately weak, just strong enough to make the Krethians think they had accomplished something by breaking it, but not strong enough to actually protect the information. Captain S. Haler monitored the operation from the bridge of her cruiser and watched as Webb orchestrated a symphony of deception that made her secondary hearts ache with moral discomfort. "How many of your people are embedded in Krethian space?" she asked Webb during one of his brief rest periods. Webb looked at her with those calculating human eyes. "I cannot tell you that, Captain," he said quietly. "But I can tell you that human intelligence services have operatives in every major power in this region of space, and most of the minor ones as well. We do not do this because we are aggressive," he added. "We do this because knowledge is survival, and humans learned a long time ago that the species with better information wins." The Krethian response came exactly as Webb predicted. Their honor code interpreted the Coalition withdrawal as cowardice that demanded punishment. Admiral Vorkthan, commanding the Krethian Armada, issued a formal declaration condemning Coalition weakness and vowing to teach the younger species the price of abandoning their responsibilities. The Krethian fleet accelerated their advance, pushing harder toward the colonies and extending their supply lines beyond recommended safety margins. Webb watched the tactical displays with the focused intensity of a predator tracking wounded prey. "They are angry," he observed. "Angry warriors make mistakes." Phase 2 executed when the Krethian Armada entered the region of space that human engineers had spent the past month seeding with disguised proximity mines. The mines looked like ordinary stellar debris, the kind of space rocks and frozen volatiles that littered this region naturally. Each mine was small and individually not very powerful, but there were thousands of them scattered across the most likely routes the Krethian fleet would take. Webb had calculated those routes based on Krethian military doctrine, which emphasized efficient movement and formation integrity. The first mine detonated against the shields of a Krethian heavy cruiser, causing minimal damage but maximum confusion. Then another detonated, and another. Within 20 minutes, the Krethian Armada was taking sporadic hits from weapons they could not see, enemies they could not target, and threats that appeared to be nothing more than space debris until they exploded. The damage was not catastrophic, that was intentional. Webb wanted the Krethians damaged and confused, but not destroyed. He wanted them angry and pushing forward, not retreating to regroup. Admiral Vork, the NES tactical officers, reported the attacks but could not explain them. Krethian doctrine had no protocols for invisible mines disguised as natural phenomena. This was not honorable warfare. This was something else. On the Coalition command ship, Grax the Korthax watched the tactical display with growing unease. They are wounded and confused, but they continue advancing. Grax observed, "Why do they not withdraw to assess the threat?" "Because their honor code interprets withdrawal as defeat," Webb explained without looking away from the displays. "They would rather die advancing than live retreating, and we are using their cultural values as a weapon against them." The Korthax warrior was silent for a long moment. You understand them better than they understand themselves. Grak said slowly, Yes. Webb agreed. That is what intelligence operations are designed to achieve. Phase 3 began as the damaged Krethian fleet approached the 3 colony worlds. They intended to conquer. Krethian sensors detected the colonies exactly where they should be: cities, intact infrastructure operational. But the life sign readings were wrong, far too low. Admiral Vork then ordered detailed scans, and the truth became clear: the colonies were empty. Every civilian had been evacuated. The Krethians had fought through mines and taken damage to conquer. Empty buildings. Vork then stood in his command chamber, struggling to understand what was happening. This was not how warfare worked. Enemies did not evacuate before battles. They did not set invisible traps. They did not lie about their intentions. Where was the honor in any of this? His tactical officers reported more disturbing news. Coalition fleet signatures were appearing on long-range sensors, but not in front of the Krethian advance, behind. The Coalition had somehow moved forces to cut off the Krethian supply lines without being detected. How? Vork then demanded. How did they move a fleet without our sensors detecting it? His sensor officers studied the readings carefully. Admiral, these are not military fleet signatures. The officer reported with confusion evident in his voice. These are civilian vessels and merchants, transports, even passenger liners. Why are civilian ships moving into a combat zone? In the Coalition Command Center, Webb was explaining exactly that to officers who looked like they could not decide whether to be impressed or horrified. We did not move the military fleet. Webb said calmly, we armed the civilians. He pulled up the tactical display showing thousands of civilian vessels now positioned around the Krethian fleet. Each vessel had been modified with military-grade weapons over the past month. Not enough firepower to match a warship, but distributed across thousands of independent targets. The cumulative effect was devastating. These are not soldiers, Lelphus said, his voice carrying shock. These are merchants and transport workers and ordinary citizens. Yes, sir, Webb confirmed. In human military history, we call this guerrilla warfare and civilian resistance. Every human-civilian vessel in 3 sectors volunteered for this operation after we explained the situation. They understand that sometimes ordinary people have to fight. Captain Shillar watched the displays with growing horror. You weaponized your civilian population, she said. You turned non-combatants into combatants. Webb turned to face her. I asked for volunteers and thousands of humans answered, he said quietly. My species has a long history of civilian populations defending themselves when necessary. These people are not helpless victims waiting for professional soldiers to protect them. They are citizens who understand that survival sometimes requires everyone to contribute. The civilian vessels began their attacks using tactics that no military doctrine prepared. The Krethians to counter small ships darted in from unexpected angles, fired weapons, and immediately retreated before the Krethians could target them effectively. They did not form battle lines. They did not engage in honorable single combat. They swarmed like insects, stinging and retreating, creating chaos and damage. Without ever presenting a clear target, Krethian warriors, trained for thousands of hours in ship-to-ship combat, found themselves unable to apply their skills because the enemy refused to fight properly. Human merchant captains who had never fired a weapon in combat executed military maneuvers with disturbing competence. Mining ship operators used their knowledge of asteroid fields to hide and ambush transport. Pilots who had spent careers moving cargo now moved to attack positions with precision. It was as if every human instinctively understood warfare, even without formal military training, because in a sense, they did. Webb had explained it during the briefing. Humanity spent 10,000 years fighting itself, and that evolutionary pressure created a species where even civilians understood tactical thinking. The Krethians were not fighting an enemy military. They were fighting an entire species of natural-born strategic thinkers. Admiral Vork then watched his fleet chord. Admiral Vork then stood in his command chamber, surrounded by tactical displays that no longer made sense and communication systems that no longer functioned properly. His fleet was in chaos. 300 years of Krethian military tradition had prepared him for honorable combat against worthy opponents, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. Report. Vork then commanded, his voice still carrying the authority of rank, even as he felt that authority becoming meaningless. His tactical officer manipulated controls with shaking manipulator appendages. Admiral, we have lost coordinated communications with 40% of our fleet. The officer reported. The remaining vessels are operating on backup systems, but those systems are showing inconsistent data. We cannot confirm if our sensor readings are accurate, or if they have been compromised. Another officer spoke up, his voice carrying the stress of someone watching their entire worldview collapse. Admiral, the civilian vessels are not engaging in any recognizable attack pattern. The officer said, they strike and retreat with no apparent coordination, but somehow they are avoiding our targeting systems. It is as if they know where we will aim before we aim. Vorkthan understood what that meant, even if his officers did not want to say it directly. Humans had infiltrated their tactical system so deeply that even their targeting computers could not be trusted. How long had the humans been inside their networks? Weeks? Months? Years? The Krethian admiral thought about all the routine communications his fleet had sent and received over the past year. All the tactical data they had shared, all the supply requisitions and maintenance schedules and crew rotation plans. Had humans been watching all of it? Learning every detail of Krethian military operations while pretending to be merchants and diplomats and ordinary civilians. Get me a direct communication line to the coalition fleet. Vorkthan ordered. Use the emergency backup systems that are hardwired and cannot be compromised remotely. His communications officer worked for several minutes before establishing a connection. The holographic display activated, showing the bridge of a coalition vessel, but the face that appeared was not Commander Velthas or any of the coalition military officers Vorkthan had expected. It was the human Lieutenant Marcus Webb, stood in what appeared to be the coalition command center, surrounded by officers from a dozen species. The human looked tired, but his eyes still held that calculating intensity that Vorkthan was beginning to understand meant danger. Admiral Vorkthan, Webb said with a slight nod that might have been respectful. I am Lieutenant Marcus Webb of the Human Expeditionary Advisory Corps. Commander Velthas has authorized me to negotiate your surrender. The word surrender hit Vorkthan like a physical blow. His fleet had not been defeated in honorable combat. They had been systematically dismantled by an enemy who fought without honor, but with terrifying effectiveness. You, Vorkthan said, his voice carrying emotions he could not fully name. This was all you. The withdrawal was false. The mines were yours. The civilian vessels were armed on your orders. You infiltrated our systems. Webb did not deny any of it. Yes, Admiral. The human said simply, this operation was planned and executed under my direction with the authorization of Coalition Command. Vorkthan felt his warrior pride demanding that he refuse, that he fight to the last vessel, that he die with honor rather than surrender to deception. But he also felt something else: responsibility for the warriors under his command. The realization that continuing this fight would only result in their deaths for no purpose. The human had already won fighting. Now would just add casualties. What kind of species fights this way? Vorkthan asked, genuinely trying to understand. What kind of warriors use lies and deception and invisible weapons? Webb's expression shifted slightly, showing something that might have been sadness or regret. A species that learned warfare by fighting ourselves. Admiral, the human said quietly, humanity spent 10,000 years in constant conflict on our homeworld. We fought each other with every weapon we could create and every strategy we could devise. We know every dirty trick, every deception, every ruthless tactic because we used them all against opponents who thought exactly like us. Webb gestured to the tactical displays. Your species developed honorable warfare through thousands of years of conflict with external enemies. He continued, you created codes and traditions that made warfare predictable and limited its destructiveness. Humanity developed warfare through internal conflict where there were no rules and no limits because we were fighting for survival against enemies who were just as intelligent and creative as we were. The human met Vorkthan's eyes directly. We do not fight with honor. Admiral, we fight to survive, and we have gotten very, very good at it. Vorkthan was silent for a long moment, processing this information. So this is what the coalition has gained by accepting humanity as members, he said. A species that excels at dishonorable warfare. We have gained allies who can win. Webb replied, and we have offered those allies strategies that minimize casualties on all sides. He pulled up casualty reports. Your fleet has taken damage, but we have not destroyed a single Krethian vessel. Webb said, coalition military casualties are minimal. Civilian casualties are zero because we evacuated before the engagement. This war can end right now with most of your warriors alive to return home. Is that not preferable to honorable death? The question struck at the heart of something. Vorkthan had never questioned before Krithian military. Tradition celebrated dying in honorable combat. But was honor worth more than life? Was tradition worth more than survival? You offer mercy, Vorkthan said slowly, even though you have already won. Yes, Webb confirmed, because the goal of this operation was never to destroy your fleet. Admiral, the goal was to stop the threat to coalition colonies with minimal loss of life on all sides. We have achieved that goal. Continuing this engagement serves no purpose. Vorkthan looked at his tactical displays showing his scattered, damaged fleet surrounded by thousands of civilian vessels and the fresh coalition military fleet. He looked at his officers who were waiting for his decision. He thought about the warriors under his command who trusted him to lead them. What are your terms? Vorkthan asked. Webb outlined the surrender terms, which were surprisingly generous. The Krethian fleet would stand down and withdraw to designated coordinates. Damaged vessels would receive assistance with repairs. Wounded warriors would receive medical care. There would be no punitive measures beyond the Krethians. Agreeing to cease hostilities and enter peace negotiations. These terms are honorable, Vorkthan said with genuine surprise. Given that you fought without honor, I expected you to demand harsher conditions. Webb shook his head slightly. Admiral, we fought without honor because that is how humans fight when we must, he said. But we can offer generous terms because we are secure in our victory. There is no need for cruelty when the outcome is certain. Something about that statement made Vorkthan understand humans a little better. They separated the act of warfare from the aftermath of warfare. They would use any tactic to win, but once they had won, they could afford to be merciful. It was almost more disturbing than the deception itself. I accept your terms, Vorkthan said formally. The Krethian armada surrenders to coalition forces. We will stand down immediately and await instructions for withdrawal. Webb nodded, his expression showing what might have been relief. Thank you, Admiral, the human said. Your cooperation will save lives. The communication ended and Vorkthan issued orders for his fleet to stand down. As his warriors acknowledged the surrender commands, Vorkthan found himself thinking about the human's words, a species that learned warfare by fighting itself. 10,000 years of constant internal conflict. No honor codes to limit the brutality of external enemies to unite against until they nearly destroyed themselves. What kind of species survived that and came out the other side still capable of mercy? What kind of warriors could wage ruthless war and then offer generous peace? On the Coalition command ship, Commander Vel'Thas approached Webb as the human finished coordinating the surrender procedures. 68 hours. Vel'Thas said, "You estimated 72 hours and you were off by 4 hours. Quite precise." Lieutenant Webb did not look pleased with himself despite the successful operation. "The Krethians are honorable warriors." "Commander," Webb said quietly, "they did not deserve to be manipulated like this. That they threatened civilian colonies." Vel'Thas pointed out, "You saved those civilians. You saved most of the Krethian warriors as well by ending this quickly. Why? Do you look troubled?" Webb was silent for a moment before responding. "Because I just proved to the entire Coalition that humans can wage warfare more effectively than species with millions of years of military tradition," he said. "I proved that deception and psychological manipulation and ruthless tactics work better than honorable combat. That is a dangerous lesson." "Commander," Vel'Thas studied the human carefully, "you are worried about what happens when other species learn to fight the way humans fight." The Zentari realized Webb nodded slowly. Humanity almost destroyed itself learning these tactics. "Commander," he said, "we developed weapons and strategies so terrible that we frightened ourselves into creating rules to limit warfare. We joined the Coalition hoping to learn better ways to resolve conflicts. Instead, we are teaching the galaxy our worst habits." Captain Sholar had been ill. 3 days after the Krethian surrender, Lieutenant Marcus Webb stood alone in the observation deck of the Coalition flagship Eternal, vigilant, staring at the stars through the massive transparent aluminum viewport. The operation had concluded. With 0 Coalition military casualties and minimal damage to the Krethian fleet, the 3 colony worlds were being reoccupied by their civilian populations. Peace negotiations between the Coalition and the Krethian Empire were proceeding with surprising cordiality by every measurable standard. The operation was a complete success. Webb looked exhausted and troubled. Captain Sholar found him there in the quiet hours of the ship's night cycle, when most of the crew was resting. She approached slowly, giving the human time to acknowledge her presence. "You should be celebrating." "Lieutenant," Sholar said gently, "you saved thousands of lives. You ended a war in less than 3 days. Coalition Command is preparing commendations for you and your team." Webb did not turn from the viewport. "I lied to honorable warriors," he said quietly. "I manipulated them using their own cultural values as weapons. I turned their integrity against them. That is not something to celebrate." "Captain," Sholar moved to stand beside him, her forearms folded in a gesture of contemplation. "But you also saved their lives," she pointed out. "Most of those Krethian warriors will return home to their families. Is that not worth the deception?" Webb was silent for a long moment. "It should bother everyone." "Captain," he finally said, "what we did should bother everyone." He turned to face her, his human eyes showing an emotion the Orvian captain was learning to recognize as deeply conflicted. "Self-awareness. Do you know why humanity was so eager to join the Galactic Coalition?" Webb asked. "Do you know why we were so desperate to find other intelligent species?" Sholar's secondary heart skipped a beat. She had not considered this question before. "I assumed humans wanted access to advanced technology," she said, "or perhaps trade opportunities and cultural exchange." Webb shook his head. "We were terrified of ourselves." "Captain," he said simply, "for 10,000 years, humanity fought itself with escalating brutality. We developed nuclear weapons that could sterilize our entire planet. We created biological weapons that could kill billions. We designed strategies so ruthless that they horrified the generals who conceived them." He gestured to the stars beyond the viewport. "We were on the edge of destroying ourselves." Webb continued. not through ignorance or accident, but through the deliberate application of our intelligence to the problem of killing each other more efficiently. We nearly wiped out our own species because we were too good at warfare. Shalar felt her secondary hearts beating faster as she understood what the human was saying. You joined the coalition hoping to learn a better way, she said slowly. You wanted older, wiser species to teach you how to resolve conflicts without destroying yourselves. Yes, Webb confirmed. We hoped that species would survive for millions of years might have wisdom we lacked. We hoped to learn how to be better than we were. His expression became even more troubled, but instead we discovered that we are the aberration. He said, most species in the galaxy fight with honor and rules and limitations built into their cultural frameworks. They develop warfare as ritualized combat or as contests of strength with agreed-upon boundaries. Webb looked back at the stars. Humans do not have those instinctive limitations. He said, we created rules for warfare deliberately and painfully after nearly destroying ourselves multiple times. Our limitations are learned behaviors, not evolutionary instincts. When threatened, we default to the strategies that kept us alive when we fought everything including each other for survival. Shar understood now why Webb looked so troubled despite his success. Today you proved that humanity brings something dangerous to the coalition, she said. Not honor or wisdom, but efficacy. The ability to win at any cost. And you are afraid of what that means. Webb nodded slowly. Humanity does not bring honor to warfare, Captain, he said. We bring efficiency and ruthlessness and the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 years of constant conflict. We bring strategies developed fighting opponents who were just as intelligent and creative as we were. That should terrify everyone, including us. The two officers stood in silence for a while, contemplating the implications. Finally, Essler spoke. What happens now, Lieutenant? She asked. Now that the coalition has seen what human warfare looks like, now we hope that other species learn the right lessons. Webb said, we hope they learn that ruthless tactics can coexist with merciful outcomes. We hope they understand that efficiency in warfare means fewer casualties, not more cruelty. He looked at the Orvian captain. But mostly we hope that the galaxy never needs to see humanity truly at war. He said quietly, because what I showed you today was restraint, Captain. This was humans fighting carefully, deliberately limiting ourselves because we were operating under coalition, ethical guidelines and trying very hard to minimize harm. I used deception and psychological manipulation, but I avoided lethal force whenever possible. I weaponized information, but I did not weaponize disease or environmental catastrophes or any of the truly terrible things humans are capable of. Shalar felt a chill run through her secondary nervous system. You were saying this was humanity being careful, she said. What would humanity at full war look like? Webb's expression became distant. I hope you never find out, Captain, he said. I truly hope you never find out. Several days later, Captain Shalar filed her official report on the Sigma Station. Operation with Coalition Command. The report was comprehensive and detailed, covering tactical decisions and strategic outcomes. But she also included a new protocol that she recommended be distributed to all Coalition military commanders working with human advisors. The protocol read, when coordinating with human military personnel, officers should monitor human participation in tactical planning sessions carefully. Human silence during briefings should not be interpreted as agreement, lack of interest, or absence of contribution. Rather, silence from human advisors typically indicates they are formulating alternative strategies based on their species. Unique approach to conflict resolution. Human military doctrine emphasizes deception, psychological warfare, and strategies designed to achieve victory through means other than direct combat. This approach often makes other species uncomfortable as it violates traditional codes of honorable warfare. However, Human strategies have proven highly effective at minimizing casualties while achieving operational objectives. Recommendations: request human input proactively during planning sessions rather than waiting for humans to volunteer information. Be prepared for tactical proposals that conflict with traditional coalition doctrine. Evaluate human strategies based on projected outcomes rather than adherence to conventional approaches. If a human advisor becomes silent during a battle briefing, immediately request their assessment. Their reluctance to speak often correlates with the severity of the tactical situation and the unconventional nature of their proposed solutions. The protocol concluded with a statement that would become famous throughout coalition military circles. A quiet human is not an absent human. They are a human at work. Respect this. Learn from it. And if you value victory over pride, trust it. The protocol was officially adopted by Coalition Command and distributed fleet-wide meanwhile. Peace negotiations with the Krethian Empire progressed rapidly. Admiral Vorthin requested a personal meeting with Lieutenant Webb, which was granted under appropriate diplomatic protocols. The two met in a neutral conference room aboard a coalition diplomatic vessel. Vorthin entered the room with the formal bearing of a Krethian military officer, but his expression showed genuine curiosity rather than hostility. Webb stood and offered the human gesture of respect. A slight bow of the head. Admiral, Webb said simply, I am honored that you requested this meeting. Vork then studied the smaller human for a moment before speaking. You fought without honor. Lieutenant, the Krethian said, you used deception and manipulation and strategies that violated every principle of warfare my people hold sacred. Webb did not deny it. Yes. Admiral, he said, I did all of those things. And yet when you had won, you offered mercy. Vorkthan continued, you provided medical assistance to our wounded. You helped repair our damaged vessels. You negotiated peace terms that were generous, beyond what military victory required. The Krethian warrior bowed deeply, a gesture of profound respect in his culture. You are a contradiction. Lieutenant Webb, Vorkthan said, you wage ruthless war, but you show compassion in victory. You have no honor in combat, but you demonstrate integrity in peace. I do not understand. Your species, Webb returned the bow. Humanity is a contradiction. Admiral, he agreed, we are capable of the most beautiful cooperation and the most brutal competition. We build civilizations and wage wars with equal passion. We can be incredibly kind or incredibly cruel, depending on circumstances. He met the Krethian's eyes. That is what makes us dangerous. Webb said, we can tame multitudes and we can shift between them rapidly, but it is also what makes us desperately want to be better than we are. We have seen what we are capable of when we embrace our worst instincts, and it horrifies us. That is why we need species like yours, Admiral, to remind us that there are other ways.